Hi, I'm Andrea Cawelti, the Ward Music Cataloger at Houghton Library, and I'm here today to talk to you about a very exciting opera manuscript here at Houghton, which has recently been performed for the first time by Opera Creole and Opera Lafayette. You may have heard about this exciting rediscovery in several recent news pieces, including an article in the New York Times. I'm going to share a little bit of backstage information for you. Houghton received the full orchestral score portion of the collection in September of 2007, and charged with cataloging the collection, I opened the box holding Maestro Dédé's score in April of 2008. I was immediately curious, as I had never heard of Dédé, so I looked him up in the Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians. There wasn't much information about him at the time, but enough to see that he was an early Creole composer and musician, which absolutely astonished me. So I contacted Suzanne Flandreau at the Center for Black Music Research in Chicago. Being a native of Chicago myself, I was familiar with the center and Suzanne's work and knew that she would ensure that the score was well publicized. A researcher came to Houghton to study the score in 2010 and paid to have the full work digitized so that the score would be available for researchers everywhere. Sally McKee, who was investigating Edmond Dédé at the time, then included the Morgiane manuscript in the research for her 2017 book, The Exile's Song. The miraculous story of how the opera came to be performed at the beginning of February is well covered in the press, so I'll just close by showing you some interesting parts of the score to give you a flavor of what opera looked like from an African-American composer in France in 1887. Edmond Dédé was an African-American Creole composer and musician, born free in New Orleans in 1827, but who, as you might imagine, found life to be increasingly difficult in the United States as systematic racial prejudice became more restrictive. So, after living in Mexico briefly, he moved to Paris in 1857. There, after studying composition privately at the Paris Conservatory with Halévy, he was eventually able to make a living as a conductor and composer, chiefly in the Bordeaux area. He composed several ballets and some operettas, which are performed at various French theaters. His opera, Morgiane ou le Sultan d'Isfahan, which he completed in 1887, was scheduled to be performed, but the planned performance fell through, and he was apparently unable to find another venue to perform the work. Dédé died in 1901, and at some currently unknown point, the score came into the collection of Jean-Marie Martin, a Belgian conductor and avid opera collector. When Martin died in 1979, he left his substantial collection to Bernard Perrot, a music dealer in Paris. Perrot added some of his own finds to the collection, and in 2000, after meeting with Harvard's music library director, Virginia Danielson, he began to sell the collection, numbering over 10,000 scores by this time, to Harvard in parts, financed by retired Harvard professor of musicology, John Milton Ward. Jean-Marie Martin rebound many of his collected scores in colorful silk fabric with durable vellum spines. So we have no idea if this Dédé score was originally bound prior to that time. Martin chose a lovely dark red silk for this score. Acts 1 and 2 are bound into a single volume, and Acts 3 and 4 bound into a second volume. So they are individually quite large. Opening up the score, we can see that Dédé edited the copyist title page a bit later. The pages are mounted to stubs, as you may have noticed, and the stubs are quite stiff, but fortunately the pages are still in pretty good condition. The edits are very interesting on the title page. Did Dédé decide, after all, that the role of Morgiane was more important than that of the Sultan? He also added the date and Bordeaux. Was Bordeaux where the opera was planned to be premiered? Or was that where the opera was composed? There are many questions about this score, which I hope will be answered one day. Some of the score is what appears to be a copyist hand, but we find a lot of annotations, deletions, and corrections throughout the score. The text appears to be in a different hand from the music copyist. Could this be the hand of Louis Brunet, the librettist? You can see here the hand of the music copyist, but you can see here the hand of the librettist. These seem to match, but to me, these don't seem to match. There's a lovely aria for Amina, the daughter of Morgiane, right in the first act. And you can see that it starts with a beautiful little roulade here for the voice. And if you look carefully in the gutter, you can see that this was actually noted in a soprano clef. Now, voice clefs are not very common in today's music. We often see voices, except for the bass part, in the G clef. But in this case, Dédé chose to note several of the roles in the soprano clef, the tenor clef, and the baritone clef. So as you look at this and you think, wow, my goodness, that goes very high, doesn't it? You will want to keep in mind that it actually sounds about a third lower than the way you're seeing it. But it's a very sweet aria where she's saying, ah, merci, ah, cher Ali. Ali is her husband-to-be, and Ali and the chorus have just sang a little number about how wonderful she is. And so she sings a very gracious little aria, thanking all of them. And you can definitely see here that Dédé has been at work, and these are actually two different staffs, and he's changed the orchestration here, and he's changed a bunch of other things. And the roll goes on, and the aria goes on, and it becomes quite high eventually. And you can see the roll. Carrying on across the staves to the end. I'm just using this as an example of some of the music writing. Dédé really had a very good handle on how the voice works. And as you can see, it gets higher and higher as she gets more excited, and because she's very, very happy to be just about to get married. And then eventually the aria comes to an end, and the chorus comes in, and there are other interjections. This introduction to the third act is absolutely gorgeous, and when I heard it in the theater, I just couldn't believe it. And there's an example of how the copyist title page looked before Dédé added his changes. Now here is the beginning of the third act, and you can see that it's almost all for winds, and eventually it just becomes for flute and oboe, and it's absolutely beautiful, very atmospheric. Some more changes, and then it launches into the actual beginning of the act. The third act also has a very nice set of divertissement or ballet, which you can see begin here with the entrée des danseurs, the entrance of the dancers. And this ballet, which unfortunately Opera Creole and Opera Lafayette were not able to perform during the performances that they did in February. But you can see that Dédé was also very much at hand here, making changes and adding instrumentation. We hope that Opera Creole and Opera Lafayette will eventually record the ballets, because especially as we get near to the end, the writing gets quite jazzy. very syncopated, especially as it gets into the stretto near the end. You can see that there's lots of dotted rhythms. And as it comes through into the end, it looks to me to be very jazzy. And don't forget that Dédé spent the first 30 years of his life in New Orleans, where jazz was a twinkle in quite a few composers' eyes. Now, I can't possibly leave the score without showing you one of the most wonderful parts, which is right here at the end. And Edmond Dédé actually signed the score right here. When I was cataloging the score after reading up about Mr. Dédé, I was so touched to see that that was his very own hand, and that we can use that to go back and identify that some of the annotations are actually his annotations. And we have a signature here too of Louis Brunet, the librettist. And after all that Monsieur Dédé went through, I am very, very happy to be able to show his score to you at last.